Hey everybody, welcome to the stream. I'm Ian Douglas. I'm the author of this website, techinterview.guide, and tonight I got a special guest for us. Please welcome Taylor Dorsett. Taylor, thanks for hanging out with us tonight. Taylor runs a podcast, and we're going to get into all those details. And you've been doing YouTube videos and some live streaming and putting this stuff up on YouTube to help people get ready with interview prep. And that's how I found you. And I'm connected with you and said, hey, we should get together and nerd out on interview topics and so on. So appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah,
Once you start us off with an intro, like who's Taylor? Tell us about you and tell us about your background, and we'll get into some questions about like how you got into tech and so on.
yeah. Well, thanks. I'm happy to be here. My background, I'm an engineer currently. Before my career in software development, I was a tech recruiter for many years and ran a tech recruiting office. And then I also worked at a coding bootcamp for a couple of years, basically as their director of outcomes, helping people get their first job and kind of building what that curriculum looked like. So I've spent a lot of time helping people get into software or connecting people with other software jobs. And then my current role right now is with levels.fyi, and we help people. I always say the easiest use case is think if you're an engineer at Google, you get an offer for an engineering role at Facebook. We help you see, is this a promotion? Is this a demotion? Is this the same level across these two companies, right? And what should I expect from a compensation standpoint, right? So just
Yeah.
trying to make all that data more visible.
How how do you level that like across like one company to another? Like how do you draw those parallels? Like I've seen sites like career ladders and so on where it's like, oh, an entry level dev should be doing this and an intermediate dev should be doing this and senior level should be doing this. But how do you correlate that between like so many different companies? Like I know there's probably some algorithmic thinking and so on in there, but when it comes to like the amount of responsibility and so on, like how do you kind of compare apples to apples?
Yeah, it's actually so there isn't any algorithm based work on that basically the levels comparison right now for us. It's really a manual process because it is difficult, right? It's hard to say what's the equivalent of an E5 at Facebook versus a L4 at Google, right? Like,
Mm.
so a lot of it was just talking to people that are in those roles, right, and saying what are the expectations for someone in this role, and then seeing how does that compare externally, and also kind of promotion metrics and a lot of basically everything internal that company says this is what we look for in this level, then seeing how that compares with other companies. So it is very much a manual process, and that's why Levels certainly has a lot of data, but constantly trying to add more of, okay, can someone else share what they think, right? Can you
Yeah.
share what you think Postman's levels compare to Google, so then we can have some levels for Postman, something like that.
Cool. Just real quick, Canal, thanks for the follow. Appreciate that. We'll get some blinking lights and applause. Good to see you. If you are who I think you are, I think we worked together at SendGrid back in the day. So welcome. Drop by. Yeah. So, I mean, there must be an enormous amount of data that people submit. Like, do users come in and say, like, I got in at L5 and this was my comp package? Is that how Levels is kind of like balancing out like this level, like this position at this company should pay between this range and this range? Is it based on user submitted data, or does Levels FYI actually go out and like, you know, check that data is valid, or can I just go in and like wreck the numbers by submitting something really off the wall?
Yeah, great questions. It's actually funny. There's so most of our data is users submitted, right? They're saying, hey, this is recent offer that I got, and that's you'll see we have basically anonymized data where you can see, did this offer come in March, right? Did this offer come in December of last year? And that helps you see is how relevant is this for you, right? Did it come in 3 years ago, and it's probably been drastically different, right?
Right.
Since then. But actually, recently we've had a lot of companies themselves. CTO of a name brand company recently emailed us saying, hey, you have to fix our levels, and because we just changed them, we just adjusted them for this year, and our comp ranges, right? We need you to say this is the amount, because they recognize that so many people are coming to the platform looking for that data, and when they look, they went, oh, this isn't right. We got to update it for this year, right? So it's actually
Cool.
really interesting that we're seeing that company specific people addressing it now.
How big is Levels FYI? Like how many engineers or how many employees are there in the whole company doing that kind of stuff?
Yeah, full-time staff is pretty small. Definitely a startup. We've got we just had our company on site in California last week and or the week before, and I think there's 10 of us there full time.
Wow.
And then we have a whole slew of part-time employees as well, who are contractors in kind of a variety of different roles. The largest kind of section being our coaches, our negotiation coaches. We have a negotiation service where, let's say, you get an offer from a company and you want to negotiate, but you don't know how to do that, right? We can help you write those emails, prep you for those phone calls, walk you through that process, right? And that's actually how I got connected with Levels in the first place. Was I saw that this exists, and I was like, oh, I know how to do that. I don't, and I was in an engineering role at the time, not with Levels, but I wasn't really using my recruiter skills anymore, and I was like, oh, I can do that, right? So that's how I initially got connected with the company.
Interesting. So what drew you to like getting connected with the code school and like going down that path? Like what started you down that journey?
Yeah, so my first job right out of school was as an entry-level tech recruiter, which is very much a sales job. It's, you have 100 resumes, you got to call 100 people and hope one of them wants a job, and then hope your team is offering that job, right? Not a super enjoyable job, but I'd done theater in college, I wrestled in college, I did improv in college, and I always say doing tech recruiting wasn't as bad as getting hit in the back of the head every day for 8 years, right? And it wasn't as bad as standing in front of a room of a couple hundred people and bombing, right? So I was pretty okay at it, and kind of rose through the ranks at this first recruiting company, and then got to the point where I realized, okay, I don't really want to do this forever, and that's when I got involved with the coding boot camp. I started looking at what other options are there, right, and how can I kind of do stuff that's not purely tech recruiting, right? Like something else, but adjacent to this space, because I enjoyed working in the tech field. And that's when I got connected to Actualize, which was the coding bootcamp that I worked for. And again, they were probably about the same size at the time, less than probably 10 full-time employees, and just looking for someone to help people figure out how do we get jobs, right? What do we tell our bootcamp graduates once they actually graduate. And up until that point, it had been a lot of kind of manual, let's make introductions, because the class sizes were fairly small. But then we got to a point where it's, we have 20 people graduating every couple of weeks, right? We got to scale this up.
Yeah, cool. So did you actually attend the boot camp yourself, or did you join them just to help out on the career side and then kind of moved up from there?
Yeah, later I attended the boot camp. This would have been in 2020 when I moved into engineering full time. But I worked there full time for several years, and then attended boot camp later. It was felt like the right place to go because I knew the curriculum really well. And actually, my instructor was our dean of students that I worked very closely with during my time there, right? So that ended up working out really great, and I think he dealt with me being disruptive in class well.
That's great. Good times. So what was it like for you then to, you study development, for you to go get that first job? Like, you obviously had some recruiter chops, and so you knew like the lingo and the things to do. But what was your experience like getting that first job in tech? Was it as hard as what other people faced? Did you find it a little easier? Where would you sort of put yourself on that comparison?
It was terrifying for sure. It was definitely hard. I think I found my first job pretty quickly. So I think in the sense of like how long did it take, it wasn't necessarily that difficult. But I think even knowing everything that I knew, right, of kind of statistics and number of outreach that I wanted to do, and just having a pretty in-depth network already especially within the Chicagoland area, it was still very much a stressful and scary process, right? So I think I went from basically joining the boot camp to starting my full-time job in about 4 months. So it was a pretty quick process, but the first actual work that I did was like contracting work from a friend who had a little dev agency, and said, oh, if you know how to do some basic Vue, I can hand you this, right? And it was making $12 an hour or something like that to put out some very basic code. But that was great because it was something on the resume. And then I was able to use that to actually land a full-time coding job. And I think I stuck out quite a bit because of that, right? And to get that contract work, I probably called every engineer that I had recruited over the last 6 years, and had conversations with them, right? And eventually kind of stumbled into something.
And were those phone calls like just networking, or were you saying like, hey, now I'm trying to get a job in tech, like, do you have any leads? Or like, what were those phone calls like?
Yeah, I would say disguised me saying, hey, do you have any leads, right? Like, I was networking, and I think my question was always, my ask would be like, hey, I'd love to catch up. It's been a while since we talked. I recently shifted into engineering, and I'm curious if you have any advice,
Hmm.
how to find my first job or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And almost everyone, had something to share, right? And I would always say, oh, here's a project I've been working on, right? If you want to glance at it, so they, had some context going in, and they also, I always said like, what would you do if you were my role or my seat, right? And I got all types of advice. A lot of it, I think the point of me asking for that advice was like seeing what's consistent, right? Like it was nice to see, okay, a lot of people are saying I should have some project live that I can point people to right away, right? It's like, okay, great. And it should be on GitHub and have, maybe some documentation around it. It was useful because I heard that from 25 people. I also heard I should really study the Linux kernel repos and like code base. And
That's
I personally,
hardcore right there. I
yeah,
don't even study Linux like internals.
yeah, I didn't think that was gonna be the best use of my time. That being
Yeah.
said, maybe that is good advice, right? But it was useful to see like, okay, if I talk to enough people, what's similar and what's not, right?
Yeah.
So they were very useful calls, and I'm still very grateful to a lot of those engineers who took time, because I was, basically no help to them, but just asking for advice. And, to some extent also saying if you know anyone who's looking for someone with my skill set, right, I'd love to talk to them.
Cool. So how did this turn into the YouTube channel that you got? So I dropped a link to Taylor's YouTube channel in the Twitch chat as well as over on LinkedIn. If you are watching on LinkedIn, by the way, you can leave us questions over there and we'll address those the same as we would address them if you're live over here on Twitch. But if you want your question to show up over in this panel on the screen, then you'll have to come over to Twitch and drop it in chat. But how did your YouTube channel get going? Because you've been running that for a little while now. You've got 300 plus subscribers on there, and it's kind of a hey, like come give me a code challenge and like watch me work through it, which I always kind of admire. People just being vulnerable and like putting themselves out there to like talk through these kinds of things. But you also have a lot of folks on your stream that are just chatting about interview prep and interview advice and so on. Tell us how this whole thing got started. Like, how long have you been doing this, and what are some favorite moments?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's a little over a year now. We're coming up on the 30th episode, and I think I did 24 in the first year, so just a little bit over a year. The whole idea behind it was, when I went into my first coding interview, right? I had no idea what to expect. Even though I had been a tech recruiter for 6 years, I'd built the curriculum on how to get your job once you come out of a coding boot camp, and I'd worked pretty closely with engineers throughout that time, right? It had a little bit of development experience before the boot camp, right? So all that being said, I had no idea what to expect in an interview, and my first one, I still remember, like just my heart absolutely beating out of my chest, and I had to like force myself to breathe, and like I'll do this thing where I just like tap on my legs slowly to try to like be like, okay, this is how my heart should be beating, right, and trying to get it back to that level. And I realized, oh, even with all this knowledge and being pretty confident that I could, probably find a gig within a couple of months, it was still that stressful, right? Purely because I didn't know what to expect, and thankfully the person asked me FizzBuzz question, which I was prepared for, right? I was like, okay, I got this one, right? But I still forgot how to define a function, right? I would, uh, we got through it, it worked out, but
Yeah.
it was terrifying. So I realized there's not actually a lot of content out there on like what does an interview actually look like, right? Like what is this actually going to look like, and what types of questions should I prepare for? Obviously there's a million questions to leak code, right, and a million guides out there, but less so actually walking through those questions and doing those together, right? So that was the whole idea behind it, and then it's kind of broken up into two pieces, which is what's the advice, right? Like what would you say to people, and then do an actual interview with me, right? So people get both sides of that, and sometimes I think if you watch both of them, they actually inform each other, right? You see someone describes this is our interview process, and then we do that exact type of interview, right? Which like at least 30% of I don't do well at all, right? Like I bomb those interviews, and then sometimes we're having that conversation, I'm like, oh, this is the type of interview process that I actually enjoy and I feel like I do well at, right? And then a lot of those go well. So it's a lot of fun, sometimes scary, but but a lot of
Yeah.
fun.
What are some other like memorable interviews that you've gone to where you think you did well, or you know that like there's no possible way they're gonna hire me after that? Like, what are some other things that sort of stand out, like as that new dev, and over that 4 months trying to get that first job? What was it like?
Yeah, probably the most frustrating one I had was I interview with the company. I'd sent in an application on a Sunday, and they called me 20 minutes later on a Sunday, right? And I was like, oh wow, they must be really interested. I think it's just now, in retrospect, I think they were desperately needing to hire, right? But um, the first conversation went really well, really connected with the individual, and then they said, "Oh, we're gonna send you a tech," or they asked me to send in a project. I made a whole video about my project, right, and sent that in. Went really well. They said, "Oh, we're gonna send you a little technical that you can handle," and they sent it to me, and it was in Python, which I'd never coded in before, and there's a lot of SQL stuff, and then like one little JavaScript thing, and I was like, I haven't really done any SQL stuff. I don't do Python at all, right? And I can handle this JavaScript piece. And they said, "Oh, well, we just wanted to see what you'd be able to do in a language you don't know." And I said, very little in the 2-hour time frame, that this
Yeah.
hacker rig asked me for. So
Wow.
that was just a frustrating one because I was already 2 steps in and was kind of excited about the company, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
One
that's
one
probably a
piece
big one.
one piece of advice that I've heard on that is like to tell them back, like, I can do this one of two ways. I can show you how well I can learn in that 2 hours, but there's no way I'm gonna finish it. Or I could do the whole thing in JavaScript and show you what my strengths are and show you what I'm
Mhm.
capable of in something that I do know. So if you ever do get a technical challenge and you're asked to do it in a language you don't know, you could pivot it that way and say, let me show you what I'm capable of learning and implementing quickly in a condensed amount of time. Or if you'll let me do it in this other language, which I am more familiar in, you'll get to see the strengths of like what I'm actually capable of developing. And giving the company the choice. What are your thoughts on that?
I wish I had that advice then. I think it would have went a lot better than what I did, which I think was did just the JavaScript piece and then emailed them saying, "Hey, I don't know I don't know Python," right? And then they said, "Well, show us what you can do." When I had 15 minutes less to
Wow.
to continue. So yeah, I think that's great advice.
Yeah, 2 hours to learn something new, like especially for
I
something where you might need like a virtual environment and things like that. I mean, I've done Python for years and years. Like knowing like if you don't like if you've got a system where you've never installed Python, you've never used Python, like just to get the environment up and running could be important.
yeah,
Learn all the
it
bits
was
and pieces
interesting.
you need.
I also ran into, and this is probably the I still get this, at least in the outreach that I get on LinkedIn on a regular basis, because I had a director title when I was a recruiter, and I had a lead title, I had a manager title, right? Like all of these things are still on my LinkedIn page, which means I'm coming up in people's searches when they're looking for director of software development or lead software engineer, right? So I would regularly get people who are interviewing me, and they're like, "Oh, we think you could be a really good fit for this role, and you could probably take on some manager responsibilities." And I was like, I, I may be able to, right? Like I may be able to do some people management, but I don't think you want a like very much junior level, like this would be my first full-time engineering job, also doing people management. Like this is going to be two poor things. It's going to be hard for me to actually, manage people with this skill set. So I ran into that at least a handful of times in my initial job search, and less so now. So that's good.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. So you've been doing this YouTube channel for about a year, and a lot of the videos you kind of chop into those two parts, as you mentioned. So one of them's like tell us about your interview process, and then the other parts like actually walk me through as if I'm doing an interview. Um, what are some of your favorite moments from that, as far as like things that have stuck out, or folks that you've had on your stream? Not that I'm fishing for names of people I can have on my stream, but like who are some companies or whatever that have stuck out that you've had like a really good sort of engagement with.
Yeah, there's an early episode with Francois Troubeau, who is an engineer, I think CTO, based out of the Chicagoland area. I think it's a really great episode, probably the longest one I've ever done still to this day. I think it's episode number 5. And I think my conversation with him, just his thought process around hiring and what he looks for was just a really great conversation. And then the technical, it wasn't the most complicated problem. It was check if something's a palindrome, right? And I think I got through it pretty quickly. But then he actually said, okay, well, is there any other ways we can solve this, right? And then we ended up working our way through a recursive solution, which I would not have come up with on my own, but in the way it was almost like pair programming, in the way where like he was leading me, but I was able to kind of also contribute, and it felt enjoyable rather than, I feel like we've all been in interviews where clearly the technical isn't going well and you're getting hints, but it's painful, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
you feel like they're just dragging you to the finish line instead of like, oh, I'm actually learning something at this
yeah.
moment. So that's a great episode that I point people towards. And then Joe Massey is a engineer. He's at Chime now, but he was at Home Chef when we spoke. He's just, I think, has a really interesting outlook on engineering, kind of what people should look for when they hire, and actually spend a lot of time running like these internal training programs at various different companies in Chicago. That so basically, once you got started at a company, you would spend 3 months basically learning the blank company way to do X, Y, or Z, right? Which I thought was a really interesting idea, and helped them. Basically, each company he worked at ended up hiring a lot of early career folks or bootcamp graduates because they could take them from zero experience to a senior engineer in basically 3 years. And I think his just insight was really great.
It's
And that
really
one just came out.
Yeah, it's really amazing when companies are willing to invest time in their people and really say like, hey, like you're here more than just to write code. Like we're gonna invest in you, we're gonna make you better, we're gonna make you the best you can be. Let you learn what you want to learn, work on what you want to work on, and like shape and mold you into what we need you to be as an engineer here. But like really be like have that dedicated focus on developing them as a person. I think that kind of thing really stands out from a company's perspective, like as far as making them stand out, as far as like, I want to go work for a company like that that's willing to, you know, give back to me and not just expect me to give to them. Uh,
Absolutely.
it's a little rare, really when you think about it. Like a lot of people are like, yeah, the company doesn't care about you. Like they're hiring you to do some work, and there's no like emotional connection at all. It's a total business thing, and when you're used up, they discard you. And a lot of business things are very cold and very transactional in that regard. But it's really great to hear about companies that are willing to like really sort of like shelter their people and take care of them.
Yeah, so we talked about this right before we got started, but my last week at Levels is actually this upcoming week, and I'm joining Home Chef as a engineer in an engineer 2 role. And a big part of the reason that I wanted to join Home Chef was because and this is actually where Joe was working. They have a great culture of learning, development, internal training, like mentorship, right? And it's something that was a pretty stark contrast to me from my time in recruiting, right? Which sounds kind of weird. Like recruiting doesn't seem like they do a lot of like training internally, but it is a little bit of I don't know. You learn by doing the job, but they're also like, if you're doing well, you're going to get a lot of one-on-one attention because you're making someone money. Right? So they want
Yeah,
to
for
make
sure.
you better as soon as possible, so you're making them more money. So I felt like I was able to learn very quickly when I was in recruiting, while in engineering I can certainly still learn quickly, but it does feel like it's a little bit more like the company doesn't, I don't know, they're not as incentively, as financially motivated for me to learn quickly as, my time in recruiting. So it's been a big focus of mine recently to try to find a company that is the goal, right? Or they have a history of doing that, right?
Yeah. Yep. Zooey says in chat, that experience sounds amazing. To have that support is what I'm hoping my first experience is going to be like. So Zooey's starting a job in like another week, I think.
Yeah.
Might be starting their job at the same time you start yours. Says their goal is to be able to get to the level where they can become a mentor. And I would say like you don't have to wait like years and years to become a mentor. Like you can immediately start turning around and just teach people what you've already learned. You don't have to have years and years of experience to mentor other people and teach them what you know. You can just share your knowledge. The whole tagline I've got for this whole site of like share what we know and we all win. As we share that knowledge and help build other people up around us, like we're just gonna make everybody better. Zeus
Totally.
says,
And there's multiple ways to do that. So the podcast came out of that, right? Of like trying to be able to share with people. I'd say the viewership is a good mix of like early career engineers who want to know, how do I get better at interviewing, and then like engineering leadership who want to know, okay, we know we're not good at interviewing, how do we do this better, right? Or what are other people doing? The other thing is, even almost right after I graduated from my coding bootcamp at Actualize, I shifted into basically doing mock interviews with the recent graduates, and it's been fascinating for me to see. Okay, even with 6 months or a year of development experience, like I can give a lot of insights to people who are just coming out of a boot camp, right? And like that's been a really rewarding experience recently, like just seeing people and being like, oh, okay, let me give them this tips, and like they're preparing for this specific type of interview, and I can say, okay, take a breath, right? Like
Yeah.
this is a very much the easy environment, right? You can forget how to write a function here, and it's all going to be okay.
What would you say are like the common like couple of pieces of advice you tend to give out the most to people when they're getting ready for those interviews for that first tech job? Like what are some common areas that you see people sort of struggle with, or things that you're like, hey, don't forget about?
Yeah, the big one is just making sure that you are coding on a regular basis, so you have syntax down. It sounds kind of silly, right? But being able to write a for loop pretty quickly in JavaScript, right, and define a function, write a for loop, and return some type of variable, right? Like just being able to do that, I think you immediately stand out from people who are going to struggle a little bit more with doing that, right? And if you don't have to think about that piece, then okay, great, I can focus on the actual problem itself, right? That's just a basic one for early career people. I have a list of I should ask. I don't know. These are from Actualize, but I helped them make them years ago, of algorithms that I or questions that are actually pretty straightforward. But I think early career they're actually doable, rather than I think you go on Leak Code and you see a Leak Code easy question and you go, I have no idea what they're even asking, right? Like
Right.
at least that's how I felt when I graduated. These questions are like, take like return one value from this array, right? And it's just, can you do that? Right? And then they kind of build from there,
Mhm.
and it uses arrays, strings, hashes, right? Those basic data structures, just to make sure you're comfortable in with those basic things, and they're not super complicated problems. And then there are a couple that's like, you should probably know how to do fizzbuzz, because I got asked that 10 times in my early career interviews. It's still to some extent get asked that. Find a duplicate value, and or find the most recent duplicate value, right? There's a couple, if you Google like top 10 most common interview questions, like you'll probably see those regularly. So you should just learn a solution for them and be able to talk through that. Those are the big ones. Other than that, it's just, I don't know, try to breathe. It's
Yeah,
hard,
for sure.
but try to breathe.
Yeah, I've shared this on the stream quite a lot. There's kind of like a four-step process that I tell people, like, whenever you get a technical challenge, like repeat the problem back to them in your own words. Just it helps clarify that you understand what it is they want you to do. When you don't know something, ask questions. You have to clarify, like don't make assumptions, like get answers, like ask questions instead of making assumptions. And then write out some notes or write out some pseudocode of like, this is what I think I'm about to go do, and then ask them their opinion and say, "What's your opinion of this?" And lately, I'm kind of rephrasing that last little bit to tell people, don't word it in a way that says, "Does this look okay to you? Am I on the right track?" Because that projects a lack of confidence in yourself. But if you literally just use the 5 words, "What's your opinion of this?" They'll tell you their opinion, and they'll tell you whether they think it's complete and you're ready to go, or if they start asking you questions, it usually means they see something that you don't see, or that they just want you to clarify something that you've kind of written out in your notes or written out in your pseudocode, just to make sure that you've thought deeply about it, and then go get started on the problem. Once they say that everything looks good, you're good to go. Like, go get started. Go write the code. That's the fourth step. Like, go do the thing. Um, and I think just keeping organized around like how much time are you spending on the design, how much time are you spending, asking questions and getting prepared to actually go do the work, because you could spend an hour just asking questions and then you're out of time, right? So you do have to kind of
Yeah.
practice that process a little bit of like, okay, my whole design should take like 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes at most. And then by then I need to be coding. And so, how do you get all of those questions and all that clarification down in that 10-minute window, based on what it is that they're asking you to build? The complexity kind of builds up based on your seniority level. But also, the first problem that you get in a real technical challenge is usually meant to be a warm up. And so, don't
Mhm.
overcomplicate it, don't overthink it. If they're saying, like, hey, go get that first element out of the array, you don't have to think like, oh, but is the array this, or is it this data structure? Or, did you really mean this? Is like, take it at face value. It's meant to be a warm up. Just get in there, start doing it, and it's really just, how's your basic syntax
Yeah.
started on the thing, and they're really evaluating the process.
That it's funny. So So you're gonna be in an episode of my podcast. Should come out in probably about a month
Cool.
from now.
Awesome.
You're 2 episodes in the queue here, but that I think you must have mentioned that on the podcast. That third one. What is your opinion of this? Is
Yeah.
that the exact wording?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's funny when you said that. I went, oh, I literally said those exact words like 18 times over the last 2 weeks because that's how I've started phrasing things in
Mhm.
my when I'm doing interviews. Because I think before I was asking, what do you think? Right. Which is like a little more vague and open ended. And
Right.
what's your opinion of this has been really interesting to see the response of people being like, oh, I like this. Is there another way that might be better? Or,
Right.
yeah, I think this is exactly what I would do. Right. It's like, okay, those are two very different
Yeah. Yeah.
responses. Right. And
Yeah.
that kind of
And so
informs what I'm going to do.
you have to pay attention to how they answer that
Yeah.
question of like, what's your opinion of this? You have to listen. Are they dropping comments? Are they asking questions? Like, is the tone of that question kind of sound like they just want you to like clarify something, or is the tone of it like I see something you don't see? Like, hey, tell me a little bit more about how you're gonna do such and such. Like, you
Yeah.
know, then it's like, oh, maybe you see a bug that I don't see yet, because they've seen like 50 different solutions to every technical challenge that they've given, so they already have a pretty good idea which way you're gonna go, and they're gonna know the kind of those common hurdles that you're gonna hit. Uh, yeah, it's always interesting too when companies invest time in their employees, teach them how to interview. A lot of companies are like, "Hey, we
Mm.
gotta interview this Taylor guy. He's coming in for some jobs. Like, hey, Ian, go interview Taylor's like, I guess I'll go find a question on leak code. Like, you
Yeah.
know, and not knowing like how to ask questions or how to sort of coach someone through things is, the big stumbling block too. So this most recent job hunt that you did, what would you say is like, I mean, aside from Home Chef where you got the job, but like, what would you say is like your favorite sort of process that you went through, or favorite sorts of challenges or work that you had to do? Did you have to prepare like projects ahead of time or do take homes? Like, what was this recent job hunt like for you?
Yeah, so this one was interesting, especially in contrast to my initial job search. Basically, all the same people I reached out to a year and a half ago or so when I was looking for like my first job, I realized, oh, they don't like now they actually might have a job that I'm a good fit for. Right? So it's a lot easier because I'm basically having the same conversation where they go, oh yeah, we have an engineer two role, right, that you can step into. Versus like, we're not really hiring for anyone, right out of a boot camp right now. So it was interesting having those same conversations but getting a different result. That being said, I didn't do a lot of like actual applications this time around. I basically told a couple people like, hey, I think I'm looking for something that kind of fits this criteria, which was very much mentorship focused, and then saying, do you know of any place, right? And then I actually Home Chef as well as Anova, which is actually probably the other
Hmm.
company that I was most interested in, Anova International. um, were both places that I had on the top of my list because I knew they had these training programs, and they actually both happened to be clients from in the past when I was a recruiter as well. So like I just knew their organizations very well, and I had I knew people in both of those companies and was able to get referred into those, which was a much easier process. Both of them, I think, are pretty similar. Their technicals were not crazy difficult, which was great. I felt like I had really good conversations initially with folks. The technicals went fine to well, and then I was able to have like actual, because I knew that okay, at least that piece went well. I was actually able to ask engaging questions and have a fun conversation with someone, right? Even actually Innova, one of the what I feel like is probably what I'm worst at in interviewing is doing any type of system design, just because I don't do a lot of that, right? And in my capacity, I've been building things rather than designing whatever we're gonna build most of the time. So when people ask me system design questions, I often go, here's what I might do, right? Like here's some ideas, and sometimes that's what they want, or they'll take that, and sometimes they want no, but what exactly would you do to build this, right? What's the drawbacks of Postgres, right? And then I can guess, right, but I'm not going to give you the most informed opinion. But even in that system design interview with Innova, things went very well because they were more open to having a conversation of the pros and cons of things rather than like what's the exact technical drawback to using this versus that, right? Which
Right.
which was fun. And I also would say probably the worst I interviewed with some Fang adjacent companies, which is kind of an aspiration of mine, is like going that route at some point. It just got smashed in the technicals, right? Which was like I expected to happen, but it was enjoying that process and doing these interviews this time around. I was like, oh, okay, this is fine. I can get smashed in an interview now and not feel as bad, right? Like
Yeah.
it doesn't ruin my whole day, which
Yeah.
I think is comes from doing this podcast, but also just I think maybe being more comfortable as an engineer.
RC Maniac mentioned in chat my interview arch nemesis, the system design. So I dropped a link to one of my favorite system design resources on GitHub. Person walks you through like quite a lot. And one bit of advice that I give out with system design is how Bob Ross paints a picture. But the idea with system design problems is you want to start at a really high level and gradually get into detail. You don't want to like hone in on the fine little detail. Like Bob Ross doesn't start a painting by painting the happy little tree. He starts with the sky and the mountain, and you get kind
Mm.
of the general idea of like we've got this system and this system and this system. Now let's go into a little more detail on each of them. Now let's go into even more detail on each of them. But if you just focus on one little piece of it, you kind of lose the whole big picture. That's like one thing that I like to share around system design. But yeah, system design is tricky, and it's interesting that they were asking about pros and cons because a lot of that really just comes from experience of, oh yeah, I've
Mhm.
worked with that caching system. I know that Memcache, for example, it's a great caching system. It's really fast, but you can only store up to a megabyte in that cache. You need something bigger than that. You're gonna have to move to Redis, but then Redis has pros and cons. Like all these tools have pros and cons, and you really only understand that as you use them. If you only use one tool, like what's that old saying? When all you have is a hammer, right? Everything looks like a nail. If you
Everything's a
if
nail.
you if
Yeah.
you only know one tech stack, you're gonna try to figure out how to make everything work inside of that tech stack. Um, but as you start to see, other kinds of tools and other uh, tooling and languages and frameworks, whatever, you can start to draw on those pros and cons comparisons and try to find what is going to be the best tool for that particular part of the job. Zooey asked a question in chat for you, Taylor. What made you decide to move out of recruiting into development?
I have I have the answer I give to recruiters, and I have the answer I give to engineers. I could give you both. The idea so I was a third party recruiter for my entire career, which means I work as an external agency. The company pays me to basically find them a person, right, that they're going to go hire. Different from being an internal recruiter at a company where you're a full time employee of the company and you're just hiring whatever they tell you to, right? So as an external recruiter, the idea is you have to make revenue for your company, so you have to make placements. You have to. It's very much salesy focused. But the promise that I was given when I started fresh out of college was, if you work really hard, you make a bunch of money, and you run your own office in a couple of years, right? Like the trajectory is very high. Very much again boiler room salesy type of job. And that was the goal for me. And basically, I lost all my hair, but did it over the course of 6 years and was running my own office. It got to the point where I realized, oh, okay, I've hit that goal, but that's not what I want to do for the rest of my career, right? And then started seeing, okay, well, what am I interested in? What do I want to do for the rest of my career? Thankfully, I'd worked at Actualize in between and realized, oh, I do actually like engineering, and it's not all just STEM graduates or computer science graduates who are engineers now, right? So that's probably the answer I give to recruiters, to engineers, depending on how I feel about the profession of recruiting at the time. I tell them, I wanted to use my brain a little bit more day to day. Like recruiting is certainly a difficult job, but I do not think it's the most complicated job. Often you're doing the same thing over and over again, which I think for me was very frustrating, realizing, oh, I could be doing exactly the same thing 40 years from now and I would be fine, right? Versus engineering, where I feel like I'm learning something new every day, right?
Yeah, and I tell folks all the time, if you want a job in tech, you are signing up for lifelong learning. Like next month, actually, today, 27th. 1 month from tomorrow is going to be 26 years since I graduated from college. That I've been in the tech industry, and I've learned so much all the time. Like I'm constantly learning new things. Like yeah, like a lot of the foundational stuff isn't going to change. Like how you write a function, the syntax of it is going to be a little different from language to language, but how you build a function, how you build a class, how you do recursion, like none of that really changes. But the language that you use or the framework you're going to use or how you're going to build that API or consume an API or how you're going to write your tests. The communication layer of everything you're doing. HTTP1, HTTP2, HTTP3, you're going to get into Web3. Like, how are you transmitting this stuff around the internet? Like, that stuff is constantly changing. So there's always new cool stuff, which is fun, but it can also feel frustrating and overwhelming too. Of like, so much to learn. I want to go learn all the things, which is typically where I see entry level devs getting really hung up on. Of like, I can't go get that job until I learn all the things. Like, there's no possible way you can go learn all the things. Like, just
Yeah.
go deep on what you do know, and then go get a job, and then figure out what you want to learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like every 6 months I look back and go, "Oh, I can't believe how much I didn't know, and how much more I know now, and how much I still don't know." Right.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, especially early career. If you, my goal was to have a project, right, that I could point people to that I thought was good or good enough, right. And that's what I tell a lot of people is like, focus on having one thing that you can show people, and then if you can show someone something, great. Now let's work on those interviewing skills, because if you can show someone something, you'll probably get interviews, and then if you could actually do well in those interviews, great. Then eventually you'll land a job. The numbers that I saw was it often took 8 different interviews, basically interviewing at 8 different companies to get one offer, as an early career engineer. And this is numbers going off of, you know, like 2018 when I was in that role, maybe a little earlier than that. So things may have been changed. It might be easier, it might be harder now, but that's what I saw, right? So have something you can show them so you can get those interviews, and then just prepare, so you can answer those basic questions you'll see over and over and over again.
So 8 interviews to get one offer. How many applications to get those 8 interviews, though? I think is the question that most people that are trying to get
Yeah.
that first job in tech, I think that's the number they want to know. I've heard like hundreds of applications will turn into like a couple of interviews, maybe. But it really depends on what kinds of projects you've done, how you're making yourself stand out, what other skills you have, and how are you showing your value to the company through your resume, if you're doing a cover letter, the projects that you're presenting to them, like how are you showing them like this is what I bring to your company? That's what's going to make you stand out. And those are the things that are going to really kind of grab their attention. And I would say that those applications are probably more likely to turn into interviews than just blind shotgunning the same resume out to hundreds and hundreds of companies and hope one of them bites, because they're getting hundreds or thousands of applicants for every job they post, um, and it's really hard to stand
Absolutely.
out.
I do think the self-serving part of the podcast that I do is, one, it helps me get better at interviews, right? Because I'm practicing on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Um, but two, it is very much a thing that I can share with people that I do, and from an engineering perspective, in this job search around, I got probably, I don't know, at least 65%, maybe 75% of the interviews that I went to, people mentioned it, right? Maybe they weren't saying, you're going to get the job because you do this podcast that talks about tech interview, but at least it was something that stood out. And actually funny, several people were like, "Oh, I feel nervous to interview you," right? Because like you're the guy who does the interviews. And
I had that. I
I
had
said the
that
same
too.
thing to everyone.
I
Yeah,
had
I
that too with
tell
my job.
everyone.
With my job hunt back in January, I had one guy turned out to be one of my coworkers. He's like, I have high hopes for this interview. I'm like, oh no.
So what I had to tell everyone was, okay, I have no expectations of you. You have no expectations of me, and then neither of us will be disappointed, right?
Right?
Just take this down.
Funny, funny.
But those types of things stand out, right? And I can't remember if I was doing the podcast right before I got my first job or first started right after, but I was definitely having those conversations, and I had it on my resume even if there wasn't an episode live yet, right? And it to get brought up in the initial job search too.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Got a couple of first time chats. Gigi Bev, thanks for dropping by. So Gigi Bev made me some cool emojis. Really appreciate your work on that. Um, can't enable them yet, but it's like me in a purple hoodie or an orange hoodie saying "Let's go, hype, raid," all that kind of stuff. You can unlock them with channel points for 24 hours at a time, but it's not like a permanent unlock. But we will get the emojis in there at some point. I do have one of them that's animated. It'll like go back and forth between like color text, text, but we'll get the emojis in there at some point. Apparently, I've got to do this for like 2 years before I can just make them free for everybody. I didn't
Wow.
realize it was going to take that long. I've only been doing the stream like July, so got a little bit of time yet to get there, but we'll get there. And then G, who is Jay, dropped by and said, I just finished a 7 total hour interview process that ended with them saying my algorithmic skills weren't quite good enough. Disappointing that it took 7 hours worth of interviews for them to give you that kind of feedback. Um, and that's one of the things that RC Maniac also mentioned in chat too, about like they interviewed for months and months and months and months and months before somebody finally said, you're doing fine at everything except system design. That's why you didn't get hired. And realizing like that's where you need to work. That's where doing mock interviews with people who can give you good feedback makes a big difference. If you're just going to interviews, these companies aren't going to give you feedback. Sometimes as a company, you can say like, hey, can you tell me what I did well? Because they don't want to tell you what you didn't do well because they're worried that you're going to sue them and whatever. But if you position it and say like, can you tell me like what was one thing that stood out to you that I did really well, and start
Mm.
collecting that feedback from companies. Companies are like, you know what, you communicate really well. Like you brought that across like really good. Like you explain your ideas really well. You can start to hone in on like nobody ever mentions system design. Maybe that's where I'm like lacking. You can start to piece it together yourself, or you can say like, what were the top two or three things I did really well? And I think companies are happy to share what they liked about you. They just want to be really careful about what they didn't like about your interview. But that's what we need in order to improve. And it is disappointing that you don't get good feedback, or it takes a long time to get that feedback. It's disappointing, especially when you're trying to get that first job. It's horrible.
Yeah, I think the mock interviews are huge. If you can do more of those, and sometimes people think like, oh, I gotta pay someone to do it. If you know any other engineers, right, even that can be useful, right? Doing a mock interview with another engineer of your same skill level, right? Sometimes they'll be able to point out, oh, do you know that you don't talk at all when you're coding, right? Like, oh, I didn't realize that, right? And it is a different skill set than doing lead code problems or even just doing algorithm problems on your own. Is actually talking through something while you're interviewing, and almost I try to think of as much as possible as pairing, and sometimes I try to drag the other engineer as much as possible into the exercise and think of it
Yeah.
as pairing and work with them, because it does make it a lot easier than just me hopefully knowing the answer, right, or hopefully being able to work through a solution on my own, right?
Well, you're not going to get better unless somebody can give you actual feedback on like, this is what you did well, this is what you need to improve on. And I say this on the stream pretty often too. Like if I go say, Mom, can you give me a mock interview and here's some questions you can ask me? She'd be like, you did amazing. It's like, unless that person's qualified to give you good feedback on like what you can improve on, like that feedback's kind of pointless. Like, no offense to my mom. But like you have to know that the person that you're interviewing with can give you good feedback. And that's one of the drawbacks that I find on platforms like Pramp. I love the idea of Pramp, where you pair up with somebody and you each play the role of the interviewer and the candidate, and you're each working on a problem, but you don't know necessarily who you're being connected with, and you don't know like how qualified are they going to be to give me feedback. Like, without sounding like overly general, like, oh, you need to learn how to code that better. Like, well, yeah, I know that, but like, give me specifics. Like, what can I specifically go work on? Like, what's some actionable advice that I can do? Makes a big difference when you have somebody that can give you help.
Yeah, I will say, so if you're using random individuals or friends, maybe doing it at it's as much scale as possible, as many as possible, which obviously is time consuming, but the more you can do, then you can pull out, okay, what is the consistencies throughout these, right?
Right.
Same idea if you're doing networking, like what are people regularly saying that is useful for me versus, you know, study Linux kernel source code, right?
Yeah. RC Maniac said, I did 3 mock interviews with friends who actually interview people. Only one was able to provide feedback that I would
Mm.
say was actionable. I mean, that tells you a lot about interviewing training, right? That, just because these other people interview for companies doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do a good job either. It really depends a lot on, what sort of background they have and what sort of feedback they're able to provide you. Um, and I would say the more sort of seasoned, I say that very generally because I've been around a minute doing this. The more seasoned a person is that has been doing interviewing for a long time is probably going to be better at giving you feedback. And those that have done interview training on how you listen for signals, as we call them, and what those signals are, and what kind of rubric they're even following to grade your performance, to
Mhm.
know like, are you doing well? Like, where are you falling short? Like that's where you're going to get the valuable feedback. is from people that actually do interviews specifically with the mindset of, and I do talk about interviewing.io a lot on the platform because I'm a consulting interviewer on their platform, and I do get paid to do interviews for them. But there are a lot of people on that platform that love helping people out and love giving feedback. But it is a paid platform, but they will defer the cost. So if you are a student and you're trying to get that first job in tech, they will defer it until you get that job, and then you pay them back. Um, so they do have mechanisms, low cost or free interviews until you get that job and pay them back after that. But try to find people that you can trust. I'm actually working with a couple of guys that are building out called HackerPen.io.
Yeah, HackerPen.
HackerPen.
Marshall
Yeah,
Shin,
Marshall.
right?
Yeah. So I've been chatting with Marshall quite a bit, and talking about product improvements and so on for that platform, and how, like, I've told him several times, like, dude, I will pay for your platform if you can implement these couple of ideas. I will pay to use your platform. And he's like, no, we want to do it open source. I'm like, I want a paid platform where I can, like, trust that you're going to give me support and you're going to build these things, whatever. Um, but I've been debating having a way of, like, doing these mock interviews on my own as part of techinterview.guide, where people can book my time, where it doesn't have to go through interviewing.io because they take a slice of the money that I get paid.
Yeah.
I would rather do something where I'm getting 100% of that money, minus whatever I have to pay that platform. So I guess really in the end, I'm either paying Marshall or I'm paying interviewing.io for the use of their platform. Uh, but yeah, I'm looking for a way that I can make myself more readily available to do mock interviews, just to be able to give that kind of feedback. So there are
That's how
people
I
out,
got to know Marshall.
yeah, there are
'Cause
people out there that want to give you that feedback. You got to find them.
Yeah. Yeah. I knew an engineer who I used to work with when I was recruiting who was on the podcast, Paul. I'll find the episode number. And then he actually introduced me. When I said, is there other people that I know or who, have like great insights like yourself? And he introduced me to Marshall, which was great. And then that's how I saw the Hacker Pen platform was we did a mock interview on there.
Yeah, great.
For anyone who's interested, it's Paul, it's episode number 7 on my channel. I always forget how to say his last name. It's Polish, so it's very difficult for me. But I'll post the episode link.
Mercy Maniac says, I've been rejected because the company changed budgets after the hiring team said, hire this person. Got rejected because the CEO didn't like that I didn't have a PhD after everyone else on the team said, you're awesome, I want to hire you. Yeah, it's disappointing. And I've worked at companies too where, like, even our CTO or our VP of engineering rather said everybody we hire has to have a bachelor's degree in computer science. Like, but we're hiring for, like, people to write HTML and CS. Yes, they must have a CS degree.
Yeah.
Like, why? Like, you're gonna lose out on so many good people, by putting such a silly restriction on hiring. He's like, no, I want the best of the best. It's like, well, it's one thing to want the best, like, but there's also the notion of, like, that's wasted effort. I'm not going to go get a 4-year degree to write HTML and CSS. Like, not gonna. It's a waste of time and it's a waste of talent. If you can go get a 4-year degree, you can get a much better job than just sitting around writing HTML and CSS.
Yeah, I would say everyone's going to have terrible interview experiences, and it's always a combination of companies who are busy and aren't putting time and thought into their interview process. Sometimes you just get unlucky, right? Like, I think someone else mentioned, like, oh, they said I was a great culture fit and I was a great technical fit, but they also might have had one role, right? And you were a notch below the other person, right? That's totally plausible,
Right.
as well. I mean, and often they're not going to tell you that, right? Like, oh, we picked the other person who was just a little bit better, right? Or a little bit better fit for this role in particular, and that's always frustrating because you don't see that. And I think the interview process, almost as important as interviewing, is being able to, like, figure out how do I try to, I don't know if brush those things off is the right frame, but like mentally reset after a bad interview or like some type of frustrating rejection, and then continue moving forward, because every company feels great, like, oh, this is the one, right? I think this is going to work out if the final goes well. Then I always tell people, like, okay, then go do 3 more interviews, so you'll see, like, okay, maybe the next one is going to be really great. And if you get offers from all 3 or all 4, fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it only takes that first offer to start moving everybody else really quickly. Like, offer in hand, those 3 words will move mountains.
Yeah.
Um, I think of like some other things that I can kind of draw on from like your recruiting background. Like, have you ever, like, as a recruiter, have you ever interviewed somebody where like as soon as you start interviewing them, you're like, "Nah, I'm not gonna talk to this person. I'm not gonna like suggest them for a job or hire them." Like, what was like? Does anything stand out? Where it's like the first answer they gave, you're just like, big nope.
Yeah, I've definitely had people just be confrontational in the past, like immediately.
Hmm,
And again, I was a third party agency recruiter, so I was probably calling people when they didn't want to talk to me, right? Like they did not know my call was incoming. So those ones I write off. Like there's certainly people who are
sure.
confrontational with me that then later we got along great. But I think sometimes people just have a little bit of a like I don't know, when they were interviewing, it was almost more of like I'm going to tell you these things rather than like we're having a conversation, which is really easy to get into when you're talking to a recruiter because it often feels like a recruiter's just trying to work through a script. But as much as possible as you can humanize those conversations, it really does go a long way, especially with recruiters who I think are often they're they again, I don't tell recruiters this, but they don't actually have a lot of power in the process often, right? Like they can't decide if you get an offer, what level your offer's at, what the salary is going to be most of the time, right? But they are facilitating your process throughout, right? So they often are deciding, okay, is it immediately after your call that you're getting forward to the hiring manager, or is it it's Thursday? I'll do it tomorrow, and then it's Friday. I didn't really enjoy talking to that person, so it's going to take till Monday. And then we actually had someone who's a better fit who got an offer, so you don't even get to finish the interview process, right?
Yeah,
And maybe that's not great behavior on the recruiter's part, but also I think as much as possible, if you can have enjoyable conversations with those individuals, it does make it a lot easier for them to be friendly throughout and non-combative, right? And like if you're going to work there, you probably don't want to have a combative relationship with the recruiting team, right? At the end of the
sure.
day.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of combative, RC Maniac mentioned in chat, my old coworker's first interview ended with security being called and blood being drawn. I think that might be taking it a tad too far, especially on the combative side of things. But that's a pretty extreme example.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen something like that. I've got definitely got tons of stories, but like that's the big one that I think someone who isn't having, their I think everyone who's been a recruiter has a story of like this is clearly someone's worst day, right? Like, and you just happen to be on a call with them and an interview with them. But apart from that, probably the most common thing I see is just people being really aggressive, and it's confusing if nothing else, right?
Yeah,
Like, why is this the tone? So, and sometimes it's I don't know, engineering. I would say maybe not the most empathetic career path. So sometimes I think maybe that's the type of individuals you're speaking to. Sometimes are a little bit more not necessarily screening towards like having the most agreeable conversation, but that's fine. It's just if you're aware of that, right? And especially if you've got that feedback in the past, it's something to keep in mind.
so now that you've been in the industry for a year and a half, um, what advice would you give to other new people that are trying to get that first job in tech about um, how do they stand out? Like, how do you stand out in a pool of like 1,000 other applicants? How do you get noticed by a company? What are like some of your favorite tips or, whether it's networking or as part of the application process? Like, how do you stand out?
Yeah. So networking, I feel like is a gross word, but it is useful, right? I think of network as just the ability to have a conversation with someone, right? Like, can you get introduced to someone so you can talk about tech, and you may or may not, you know, get along with that person or have a productive conversation with them, but at least can you have the option to have the conversation, right? So that's what I think of networking as, is just opening that door. So that's important. Like, just be in spaces where that can happen. There's lots of Slack spaces, there's lots of Twitter spaces where that can happen now. I personally use LinkedIn heavily to do that. I don't think everyone needs to do that, but if you're an engineer and you connect with other engineers on LinkedIn, they'll probably accept your connection request, right? And if you ask them to have a conversation, 1 in 4 probably will, right? So that would be the first thing: just have conversations with people, and then when you're having those conversations, you want to have something to talk about, right? So can you have the 2-minute version of like, this is my background, right? Like, this is what I've done, this is what I'm interested in, and this is what I've done from a technical perspective, right? And from the technical perspective, I personally am still a big believer in like have one project that's I don't know, has a front end, has a back end, has some documentation. It's on LinkedIn. Sorry, it's on GitHub, and maybe use an API or two, right? Like that's pretty broad, right? But if you can do that and actually show that on LinkedIn, oh, and if it's the type of application that can support this, it's also live somewhere, so you can give someone an address, right? Go here, right? And you'll see my thing. That's going to be hugely helpful for you. It's obviously time consuming and it's more difficult than doing 20 little JavaScript projects that are, a little calculator app. But if you can do that, I do think you stand out significantly because it looks like, oh, you actually understand how to build something a little bit more complex than probably the average person. Right. So I would actually spend a lot of time on that early on while having those networking conversations. And then you've got something on your resume. If you do just those two things, I feel like you're already going to be at kind of an advantage compared to most people, either coming right out of a computer science program or a coding boot camp. Then the last piece would be, okay, can you think of something outside the box that you can do, right? For me, it was the podcast, right? But is there, do you host some type of tech meetup, right? Is it something like that? Or do you blog, right? I know that's something else that a lot of people have done, is leaning into writing. Anything that you can mention that basically someone is going to see and go, oh, that's interesting, right? And your name gets just registers a little bit more in their head when they're looking through applications. I think gives you the leg up, and it's a game of inches, right? Like you're just trying to be a little bit better than
Slightly
someone
better.
else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the important thing here is kind of some advice that we gave earlier. Like, you don't have to be an expert to be a mentor. You don't have to be an expert in order to blog or run a Twitter space. Like, just go to a meetup and give a lightning talk on, this was my experience on how to implement this library in JavaScript, or this was my experience with setting up GraphQL, or whatever it is. Doing an experience-based talk or an experience-based blog post, no one can argue with it. It was your experience. This is what happened when I tried to implement this. I ran into this error. This is how I fixed it. Like, nobody can argue with that. They could maybe offer advice and say, oh, if you had done this, this wouldn't have happened, or you could have done this. That's fine. But if you say, like, this is how you do such and such, you're going to get 1,000 people telling you why you're wrong. And so, I would say for newcomers, absolutely, all that advice is really good. Network, build larger projects. That's a good idea if you've got the time. And then, find some other way of, like, getting your name out there, like, get yourself noticed. And I think I had someone on the stream a couple of months back. They used the word discoverable. Like, find a way to become discoverable, whether it's a Git project or Twitter or a blog or something. Like, if I search Taylor Dorsett in Google, like, what's going to come up? You know, and I really like the idea too of having your project uh, sort of live. Like, let me go experience what you've built. That's way more powerful than just, oh, here's a GitHub repo of some code that I put online. It's like, okay, well, I'm not gonna take the time to download it and, like, install it and see if it runs. Like, I don't have good time for that. I got thousands of applications to go through. But if you give me a link to click on, yeah, I'll give you 30 seconds or a minute to just click around and kind of see and experience what you built. And if it works, then I'm like, wow, you can write working code. That's great. And you know how to deploy it. That's great. That already sets you apart from everybody else that's just giving me, like, oh, here's my GitHub. If you can get that stuff live somewhere, yeah, I think that definitely stands out. When it comes to networking, I think the big thing there is, don't just connect and say, like, hey, are you available for a call? Like, give somebody 2 or 3 very specific questions. Say, if you've got time, I'd love to hop on a call and ask you about these 2 or 3 things. 5-10 minute max, whatever, if you've got some quick answers or quick advice that you can share about these things. But also give them the option of, like, hey, if you haven't got time for a call and you want to do it asynchronously, like, I'd be cool with that too. I think giving people the choice, I think, is great. Not everybody has the time to, like, be on a live stream or a Zoom call, or that maybe they're tired of doing Zoom calls all day, every day. And they're just like, you know what, I can handle this offline, like, while I'm waiting for dinner to cook or whatever. I can, like, answer a few things, just send you that email back or something like that. Like, I think people are a lot more willing to do that if you give them the choice.
Totally. And I used to always say, do you have a couple minutes, right? And, like, I was expecting to be a 10 to 15 minute call, but I would always schedule 30 minutes on their calendar, right? If I was sending them a calendar invite. And sometimes they go, yeah, that's all the time I got. Okay, perfectly fine. And sometimes we go long, right? It just, I would always try to be mindful of, obviously, I'm taking someone's time. I sent a link. So this is the first project I worked on. I will only point this out as an example of, you can have something that behind the scenes is not super impressive that you can make look really nice. That I think this homepage looked fairly impressive to people that clicked on it, and then they didn't do a lot more digging after that, which probably worked out really well for me. And to get this up and running live on a website, like I don't think I could recreate that today, right? It was like a mad effort of me working with like my bootcamp instructor at the time, and like probably frantically googling Heroku deployments, and like also trying to figure out how to even have a domain name that worked, right? But I got it up because I wanted to be able to say, oh, while I'm on a call with someone, if you type in reach out with 2ts.com, this thing will pop up, and they would click this and go, oh, this person must know what they're doing, even though I don't stand by the back end or the front end code on this platform at all, right? But it was easy to polish, right? It sounds kind of bad, but you can kind of polish a turd, especially if you know, okay, at least I could talk someone through this now. And I think that, again, it's a step up from someone else who might have a website that does exactly the same thing. The code might even be better, but if it doesn't look as impressive when someone first clicks on it, that might be, I don't know. So I don't know if that's good advice, but it worked for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like if you can get the thing deployed and, while you've got them on that phone call, say like, hey, go hit whatever .com or .dev or like whatever that website is that you're building. It's way more powerful to experience what you've built than to just say like, oh yeah, I've built all these projects that are up on GitHub. Like I'm not going to download those. I'm not going to verify that they work. But if you can give me a live link somewhere, I know that you can write working code and you have at least some idea about how to deploy it. Even if you needed an instructor to help you do it, you still learn something along the way that's maybe going to stick. But you show that you've got way more chops than like other people that are just doing that bare minimum of like, my instructor told me to make 10 projects, so I made 10 calculator apps. And it's like, okay, they're all doing kind of the same thing. Or you're doing the same, to-do list app that everybody else is making. It's like, come up with something novel, come up with something new, like go find a real problem in the world and just make some, cheesy little project that shows like, here's how I might solve, table seating arrangements for family at Thanksgiving dinner. Like, just who RSVP'd the first and they get to sit closer to the turkey or something. Like, figure out some sort of algorithm of like how people are going to sit around the table, whatever. Like just go find a novel solution to a common problem. Go build a little project about that. And I really like that idea of like, come up with, make it big enough that you're showing that you know how to plug all these pieces together, that you can take these building blocks. Like I think of like a Lego set of like, you can put all these blocks together and make something really interesting out of those blocks, as opposed to just like, yeah, here's another to-do list app. I think that kind of stuff really stands out to me when I'm looking at resumes.
Yeah, I still use this example. There was a graduate when I was working and building the outcomes department at Actualize, who built, if I remember correctly, he built an application where you could take a photo of something and then it tried to it made a 3D model of it immediately, right? Specifically focused off of cars. If I remember correctly, again, it was absolutely broken as part of his capstone. It did not work, but it looked really cool. And once in a while, like something almost like workable would come out of it, right? And he got a job very quickly after graduating. And I still think back to that and go, oh, his thing was just barely cobbled together. But it was an interesting idea that people will go like, oh, what's this? Like, oh, it crashed when he would run it, but they'd be like, oh, and then he would be, this is what it does look like. To play the video, and they go, oh, that's cool. Compared to another Facebook clone, right? Is like, there's just two different worlds, and it doesn't have to be like the most incredible idea in the world, just something that interests you, right?
Yeah.
I think it's like you mentioned, right? Just something that's useful or interesting.
BND404 asked a good question in chat. What's the main idea behind even having GitHub? Like, is it just for more advanced interviews? What are your thoughts on why we have GitHub?
I guess this is from like a recruiting perspective. I just heard so often, and I don't know if this has changed. It probably hasn't. I just heard so often from CTOs and engineering managers, VP of engineering, and that if they don't code outside of work, like I don't know, like don't send them to me or something like that, or like, can you send me their GitHub? And I don't think that's a good way to interview. But knowing that that may be the difference between you getting a job and not having a job, and that if you're coding already, you can push that code to GitHub and have a little green square that checks that box, right? It may be a good thing to do, right? So I try to push stuff up as much as possible when I'm working on things on my own, and you can even privatize things and still have those little boxes show up. It does feel a little grindy and kind of a thing we shouldn't have to do. It's kind of like having a LinkedIn. If you, you might, if you're looking for a job, it probably makes sense to have, right? Um,
Yeah, I would say from my perspective as a hiring manager, having projects on GitHub, uh, it shows me how you develop. Like if I'm, if I've noticed you enough that I want to get you in the interview mix, I'm probably gonna go pick apart your GitHub a little bit, and I'm probably gonna go look at like whatever your most recent repo is on GitHub, and just look at what kinds of commits have you made. What are the commit messages on there if it's public? So I can kind of see like, did it take 20 commits to fix a bug? And what were those commit messages of like, oh crap, I broke it again. It's like, okay, now it works. Oh wait, no, I forgot this. Like, or are you just making like a single commit with like, hey, I fixed the bug and this changed, so on. But it shows me how you work as a developer too. Like if you've got software testing in there, I can see like, did you write the software tests and then write the software? Or did you write the software and then you wrote the tests after the fact, depending on when those show up in the commit history. Now, if you commit it all at the same time, then obviously I can't help. But if you're doing like it's kind of over time, it shows me how you develop. And sometimes that's going to be a good culture fit check for me and my team. Like if I really love software development and I really love software testing, with like test driven development, and I see that your Git commit history shows that you're going to write a test, commit that test, and then write the code to make that test pass, then I know TDD, test driven development. Um, that's a check in my box, in my world. Um, and I can really only like I can ask everybody in the interview, like, do you do test driven development? They're all going to say yes. But if I can see a demonstration of that through GitHub, then I don't even have to ask the question. Or I can then come up with more specific questions like, hey, I noticed on GitHub that you follow TDD. Like, what's that process been like for you? How did you learn it? Or hey, I noticed on this project you got all this code, but you don't have any software tests. Like, what are your thoughts on software testing? Again, maybe that's something that's really important to me, important to my team. It might not be something in the job description, but it might be something of like, hey, we want to make sure that the people we hire are going to work well within the team. So let's try to find people that are good at testing. But if you put it as part of the job description, like we want people that are good at testing, then everybody's going to say that they're good at testing. Everybody follows TDD when really they don't. And so for me, being able to review somebody's GitHub and see a demonstration of how they do their work, sometimes answers a lot of questions for me, even before we start interviewing, or, in between interviews. Like, oh, something Taylor said in that interview kind of stuck out. I actually want to go check out that project and like dig into like how they called that API because it sounded a little bit novel, and now I can go dig in on that and go, yeah, all right, the way that you handled that or like worked out that problem or whatever is kind of interesting. Like that can, it can make a big difference for me as a hiring manager. Not everybody's got the time to like go in and dig in and do that kind of thing. I would say smaller companies probably have more time for doing that kind of stuff. But it also depends on their velocity and like what they're working on and the kinds of things that they care about too.
Totally. It's the same idea of like it's a game of inches sometimes. If you have two engineers that you are like dead even on, and then you're the person trying to make the decision about who gets an offer and who doesn't, and you go look and one has a GitHub that's very active and you can go in and see things versus one that doesn't. I don't know. You're probably going to give the edge to the person who has the more active thing, right?
Yeah.
Who has something that you can go and look at. So
yeah, or at least the information that I can go dig up. But
yeah, absolutely. I also think it's a way to. I'm a big believer in failing in public, right? Again, this whole job is about learning, right? Like part of learning is failing, right? Like I don't know how to do this thing. I have to go figure out how to do this thing, right? And I think the more you can do that in public, like, one, it helps you keep your ego in check, and two, shows that this is normal, right? This is a part of the job, and everyone does this, right? Which I think then helps other people learn better as well. And GitHub is a way of doing that, right? Like all my, I point out this is, I don't feel great about the code on that project, which probably means I need to go push something up that I actually can point to that I'm proud about, right? And then maybe someone can go back and look and, oh, this is clearly early career versus, oh, a little bit more mid-level, right? And I think just being able to fail in public, and I don't know, it shows growth, and also is helpful for you when you look back and go, oh yeah, I would never do that way anymore, right? But I would do it this way, and I feel so much better about that now, right?
Cool. Well, you definitely dropped some knowledge bombs on us, and some good perspective, both from a recruiting point of view, but also shifting into getting into a tech job. Told us a little bit about your recent job history and job hunt and things like that. So that first job that you got took you about 4 months to get. How long did this last job hunt take?
It was like a whirlwind process. I think I reached out to a couple people, and within 2 weeks I had 3 offers. So
Wow.
it's pretty rapid. And I don't. I think that's a mix of like having more. Like I'm a little bit more further along in my career now, so I think there are more roles that are available to me, and then people might have more that I could do internally. But also, um, they. I don't know. I think it's also just kind of a crazy tech climate right now, where like people are trying to hire rapidly.
Cool. All right. Well, I like to wrap up with my guests with asking silly questions and so on. Just taking one more look at chat. For entry level, is it better to know various languages or focus on a single programming language? I would say earlier in your career, I would go for depth over breadth of knowledge. So learn something really deep, learn it really, really well, as opposed to learning lots of things only a little bit. I think that you will stand out as a better employee if you kind of dive deep on fewer topics. I think that a lot of people kind of catch this like, oh, there's all these things to learn, so I need to go learn a little bit of everything. I think the worry there is you can stretch yourself too thin too quickly, and then you don't get particularly good at any one thing because you're trying to be a little bit good at all the things. The deeper you can go on fewer topics, I think the better time you're going to have. Um, like really focusing on how am I going to transfer the knowledge that I've learned about this one programming language. This other company wants me to work in this other language. Well, the deeper I go on the language I do know, the more knowledge I can transfer over into what they want me to learn. Whereas if you're like trying to learn 20 different programming languages at the same time, you're not going to get particularly great at any of them. And then when they do want you to go deep on something, you're really only going to get to go as shallowly as you've done with all of the others. And going deeper is going to start to feel like a struggle because that's as deep as you got on all these other things, and anything beyond that is going to start to feel really uncomfortable. So I would say go as deep as you can on fewer things earlier in your career. Taylor, any thoughts on that?
Just learn JavaScript in a backend language, or just learn JavaScript as a full stack language.
Yeah.
That'll probably get you your first job. You'll probably be using JavaScript at some point in your career. It's an easy one. Not an easy one to learn, but an easy one to, I would say, get productive in, and then you'll learn whatever else you need to once you get on the job.
Cool. Well, I appreciate all the questions in chat. Let's go with some ridiculous questions here to kind of wrap up. Let's see. Taylor, what's invisible but you wish people could see?
Ooh, germs. That would be fun.
What's the best Wi-Fi name that you can?
I can't think of any appropriate ones that I've seen that are enjoyable. We've stayed at a lot of Airbnbs we've been like kind of nomad over the last 12 months, and I've seen a lot of inappropriate ones that when I go to log on to whatever the house Wi-Fi is, they give me a chuckle, but none that I would repeat.
Yeah. I'm checking real quick to see if my neighbor still has theirs. They've got a really, really interesting.
I used to always try to make my own interesting, right? Even
Oh,
before
they
I was
changed
an
it.
engineer. But I was just, Googling other people's cool Wi-Fi names and then making that mine.
Yeah. No, they took it offline, but they used to have one It was called like "Stop Your Damn Dog from Barking" 3 a.m. something like that. It's like
I could
passive
say.
aggressive way of calling the neighbor.
Oh, so yes, I've got one now. That's appropriate. My neighbor, for many years, used to have a Wi-Fi name. It was something like get 500 or share my 500 megabyte connection for $5 a month. And I don't know how you
Nice.
would contact this person, but in theory, he was open to letting anyone eat off his Wi-Fi, which I
Yep.
always thought was a fun
Funny.
one.
That's great. RC Maniac says FBI observation van one. Yeah, I've seen like FBI surveillance van. Yeah, those are always great. How do you feel about pineapple on pizza?
I love it. Pineapple on pizza. I love what I call Hawaiian pizza, which is jalapenos, pineapple, and bacon. That's my perfect pizza.
Yeah, good one. Good one. Um, yeah, I've been getting into more spicy food lately, so I haven't specifically had jalapeno pineapple bacon, but I've had a lot of variations of like pineapple and then ham or bacon or whatever just other stuff on. I love pineapple on pizza. Um, if animals could talk, which one would be rudest?
Probably cats. I'm allergic to cats. I don't really love cats, so I'm biased against them.
All right.
But I feel like even cat people might say probably cats.
How many chickens does it take to take down an elephant?
There are no amount of chickens that can take down an elephant.
Really?
No amount. They don't have the aggression. Even aggro chickens can't take out an elephant.
All right. What would be the worst name you could give a child?
Whatever Elon Musk names his children.
Oh, that's fired. What would be the worst thing for the government to make illegal?
I don't know. Probably. I mean, this is terrible, but probably guns. That would probably
Yeah.
start the meltdown.
What would be the worst buy one get one free sale of all time?
Ooh, yikes. I don't got a good answer for you. I don't know. Stoves? It's not very useful. You don't need two of those.
Yeah, any major appliance like that. I ought to mention in chat view source. I'm wondering if that would be a weird baby name. It would be a very geeky, nerdy, but also very inappropriate kind of name to name a child. Not used to Copilot in interviews. Yeah, for sure.
Oh, I have seen a trend recently of people like I actually give this advice out a lot of people like using these. I don't think it's Copilot specifically, but like more advanced auto populators. I always tell graduates like I don't really care if you do that, but I'm positive there's going to be some engineering managers, some directors, some CTOs who see that and go like, I wanted to see you write the for loop, right?
Yeah.
And like, hey, you should probably be practice learning at it or practiced enough to write the for loop itself. So I don't love them. In your personal coding, do it, right? I should probably find one that works well, but probably not in interviews.
I also did follow up in chat. They said that there is a state that's trying to outlaw view source. There was something in the news, like I want to say 2 months ago, where somebody did a view source on an HTML page. They got like a bunch of social security numbers that someone had actually put in a comment or something, and they're like, "Oh, you like hacked our website." It's like, "Oh, of course," which is public for everybody to see. Like, yeah.
I think it was Missouri. Yeah, I it was quite an interesting read.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well, Taylor, thanks again for hanging out with us. I'm going to drop all your links in chat one more time here, so you can follow up with Taylor on LinkedIn and Twitter, and definitely go check out Taylor's YouTube. And go give him a subscribe over there as well. Thanks for dropping by and hanging out and giving us some perspective. I always love to hear from people that have done like recruiting or did some other kind of job and then got into tech, and just kind of hearing your perspective on what made you go down that path. What was that process like? How did you get that first job? How did you stand out? That kind of stuff is really helpful for everybody to hear, and I think is really important just to show like, yeah, that first job is going to take months and months and months to get, but once you get that first job, like that second job becomes much easier. Generally speaking, much easier to get that second job. But getting that first one is going to be tough. So appreciate your perspectives and thoughts and ideas. And I appreciate and I've told you this, offline as well as getting ready to do your YouTube episode as well. That I appreciate people that are willing to learn in public and just be vulnerable. Of like, yeah, I have no idea how to solve this thing. Let's struggle through it and put it up publicly on YouTube. It's like, oh, like even that makes me nervous. Like like I would love to do that too, but I'm like way too nervous to do it myself. So I always appreciate when people can make themselves vulnerable and make content like that available for others to see. Of like, here's how to work your way through it, here's how to talk through it, as well as just having these conversations with other hiring managers just to show, like, you know what, there are companies out there that are doing it differently. So definitely go check out the companies that Taylor is interviewing on his channel. Go apply at those companies. Those companies are doing things differently, and they care a lot about their people. uh, Keep us posted on your new job. Congrats on the gig. uh, yeah, we'll be in touch.
Thank you. It's been a blast. Thanks for
Yeah,
having me.
yeah, for sure. All right, well, let's go find somebody to raid real quick here on Twitch. We'll see who else is online, and then we'll give somebody a quick raid. Online. Next time it's online, we raided them on Thursday. Anybody's got suggestions, feel free to drop them in chat. I'm not seeing any of my usuals. Like Chris Burlow's online, but we've raided him a bunch. We can't raid Bob Ross as much as I would love to go throw people at Bob Ross. But none of my other folks are hanging out. So if anybody's got anybody that they want to go raid, drop some suggestions in chat for me. Otherwise, we'll just wrap up for the night. So this is going to be the last Sunday evening that I'm going to be streaming. I'm going to stream earlier in the day on Sundays going forward. So starting next month, I'm going to be streaming at 10 a.m. Pacific, and that's going to be 1 p.m. Eastern time. And so that's going to be a little bit different. I've had a handful of people from the UK reach out and be like, I want to attend your stream. I want to be able to ask questions, but I can't stay up that late. I totally can. So I'm going to be streaming earlier on Sundays going forward. Thursday night's still going to stay the same. But yeah, Sunday we're gonna change up the time. Nobody to raid. All right, I think we'll just we'll call it here then, and then gotta be somebody. There was one person earlier. There was one person I wanted to go raid earlier, but they're offline now. You know,
a nice channel of a lady drawing Paul Rudd, I think.
Maybe drawing a picture of Paul Rudd.
I don't know how rating works, but this is pleasant.
Let's go have a quick peek. Always a good idea to.
It doesn't seem like this is
Doesn't look like Paul Rudd.
Yeah,
more like Martin Short with Paul Rudd.
She's learning in public.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm all for STEM and art and stuff like that. So yeah, let's go give them a raid. Always up for something new. All right, folks. We'll see you over there. And thanks again for hanging out. We will catch you on Thursday at the usual time. And thanks again, Taylor, for hanging out today. I appreciate it. Stick around for a minute after we start the raid.
Cool.
All right, we're offline.